Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. As could be hoped for, the protests and outright uprisings against oppressive regimes throughout the Middle East are continuing and intensifying. The latest target of these protests is the current leader of Libya. Now, there are certain things that one can't be sure about with regard to the current leader of Libya. One of them is, how does one spell his name? Is it Gaddafi with a G? Kadafi with a K? Kadafi with a Q? Does it have two Ds? Is his first name Moammar or is it Muammar? Are there two M's or is there one M in his name? These things we can't be sure about with regard to the Latinized spelling of his name. We can be sure, however, that he is a brutal tyrant. And of the three leaders that have been particularly targeted by the protests, Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt, both of whom have now thankfully been overthrown, Gaddafi is certainly the worst. He has outright ordered his troops to brutally massacre protesters and anyone else who politically dissents from his regime. Of course, he has ruled Libya with an iron fist since 1969, when he overthrew the king of Libya in a military coup. And unlike Ben Ali and Mubarak, Gaddafi is not viewed very favorably in the West. This is partly due to the fact that he sponsored terrorist organizations until shortly before the US invasion of Iraq, when he was simply afraid that the same thing would happen to him as happened to Saddam Hussein. So he solemnly promised that he would stop. And then he attempted to attract more Western corporations to Libya and essentially lure Western powers and gain their favor by promising more of Libya's oil resources. This is, of course, unfortunate. Some Western governments have fallen prey to this kind of appeasement. The US has generally been fairly hostile to Libya. And I agree that friendliness to this regime is not justified. The Libyan people have begun to agree as well. This domino effect of protests throughout the Middle East has the potential to unseat some of the most heinous regimes there, some of the most entrenched regimes there. Regimes like Gaddafi's that have been in power for many, many decades. Right now, protesters control the eastern half of the country and are steadily advancing on Tripoli, which is the capital and is also Gaddafi's stronghold. Unlike Ben Ali and Mubarak, Gaddafi seems to be quite persistent in staying in Libya and holding on to the last vestiges of his power. This includes using violence on a massive scale. Mubarak may have made a show of promising to remain in Egypt and promising to remain in power for as long as he could. But because of the massive media attention and the massive pressure exerted on him in Egypt, he ultimately stepped down. And indications are the army in Egypt was very much involved in pressuring Mubarak to step down. In Libya, the army is split. Large sections of it have deserted Gaddafi, and there have even been cases of fighter pilots refusing to attack civilians. 2 of them have flown to Malta and landed there. And another one has decided to essentially evacuate himself from his fighter plane, let it crash, rather than fire on the protesters. This is very admirable and very encouraging. Also, ambassadors from Libya to various countries have been resigning en masse in protests over Gaddafi's atrocities. So there's a lot of hope that the Libyan people are far more enlightened than their leadership. And of course one can say that of virtually any population of any country. The ordinary people are far more enlightened than the elites that rule them and most often oppress them. If there's any lesson that can be drawn from these protests so far, is that when people genuinely get fed up with oppression and perceive a genuine chance to ameliorate matters and to get rid of the oppressive regime, then they can do so effectively from within. External military intervention is not required. Right now, there have been some rumblings within the international community about a response by Western countries to the situation in Libya. In my view, any manner of response should be strongly discouraged. The Western powers should, of course, condemn the atrocities of Gaddafi and other authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East, but otherwise should allow things to take their course. Because I think the protesters will clearly win in Libya. They are gaining ground on Gaddafi every day. A recent interview with the State Department spokesman was rather disturbing in that it was stated that all options were on the table. And that was stated specifically in response to a question of whether the US would be willing to use military force in Libya. This would be the most terrible mistake in terms of addressing this situation, because it could really turn back the tides of liberation in Libya and institute another oppressive regime, much like the US military occupation of Iraq got rid of the heinous tyrant Saddam Hussein, but imposed another oppressive government that has been shown to systematically beat up, rape, torture, and even murder innocent Iraqi civilians. We don't want that in Libya. And we know that US military interventions always have had unintended consequences that have magnified the very problems that those interventions were intended to solve. So, my advice to the Western powers is to let the Libyan people get rid of Gaddafi by themselves. Make it clear that no Western power supports the Gaddafi regime, and that Western sympathies are with the protesters. But otherwise, do nothing. Let individual citizens in Western countries assist the protesters if they may. But it is up to them to establish a government that truly represents their interests and will protect their freedoms. This one does not, and certainly governments like Gaddafi's throughout the Middle East, perhaps not Gaddafi's government in particular, but similar governments, say the government of Mubarak in Egypt, or the theocracy in Saudi Arabia, have very much been propped up by Western powers and are hated by their own citizens. And this fuels animosity toward the West. This fuels a desire to resist what is seen as Western influence, even when that influence comes in the form of beneficent economic forces, such as the forces of globalization. Furthermore, an important lesson that can be drawn from the Libyan protests in particular is that in the current wave of Middle Eastern protests, there is virtually no Islamist or religious motivation for the protesters. Now, it is true that the vast majority of protesters are Muslims, but that's just because the vast majority of people in the Middle East are Muslims. But what they definitely do not want is a theocracy. And we have seen that time and again in the statements made by the protesters in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Bahrain, and in Libya. They are not seeking to favor any particular religious group. Some of them claim they seek democracy. Most of them claim they just seek freedom and living conditions that are more tolerable less obviously oppressive and barbarous. And these are sentiments that can unite people of all religions, as long as they are not fanatics that believe that they must sacrifice everything for their faith. They can agree on values that both religious and non-religious people can hold dear in this world. Individual freedom, individual life, the chance to achieve prosperity, certain economic and political and cultural institutions that are conducive to peace, liberty, and prosperity. Those are values that can attain a broad agreement. And I think in the Middle East, especially because this is a region predominantly composed of young people, people whose generation is very much oriented toward technology and has very much embraced whatever bits of technology they have been able to import from the West. They have seen that life can be much better than it has been for the past 40 years under their oppressive gerontocracies that currently reign in their countries. And they have decided to take matters into their own hands. The religious fundamentalist movements are more characteristic of generations that are contemporaries of the regimes that are currently in power. Mostly very old men, men who at the youngest are in their late 60s. Mubarak was 82 when he was overthrown. Ben Ali was in his 70s. Gaddafi is in his late 60s. And it's very encouraging that these young people are finally taking matters into their own hands. Now, the Western world has a heinous double standard with regard to the protests. That is, if the regime has been a friend and ally of major Western powers like the US or the UK or France, then the condemnation of that regime is at best mild, at worst non-existent. And any kind of urging for, quote, stability or, quote, security is just euphemistic language for maintaining the status quo at the expense of the lives of innocent citizens who are being brutally oppressed. And this is not something that can be tolerated. Considerations such as oil should not trump human rights abuses. And I say this not because I'm opposed to the use of oil, though I do believe that dependency on tyrannical regimes for obtaining oil for the West is catastrophic. I say this because I believe that oil should not stand in the way of creating humane, enlightened institutions that respect liberty, peace, and progress. And the idea that the Islamists will take over is a boogeyman. Indeed, it's a boogeyman that has been invoked by Qaddafi himself, who has stated that all of these protests against him are really just orchestrated by Al-Qaeda and meant to create an Islamist regime in Libya, which is absolutely ridiculous. There has been no detectable trace of Al-Qaeda influence in the Libyan protests. And the protests began peacefully until Gaddafi started to mow down the protesters using his armed thugs. Now, in my view, it is most desirable for revolutions to be peaceful. And the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt have largely been peaceful so far, especially on the protesters' side. However, the immutable truth stands that whenever a government violates the rights of its people to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the people are so fed up that they rise up in resistance to that government, and this, as Thomas Jefferson stated in the Declaration of Independence, doesn't happen lightly, and does not happen because of minor oppressions. This happens when the people are quite fed up and can take it no longer, when they see no other feasible way out than to resist their leaders. Then it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish their government using the means that are available at their disposal. Peaceful means are always best. But if the government resorts to thuggery and to mowing down the people who peacefully demand change, then resistance to that kind of thuggery is necessary. So I encourage the people of Libya to take the city of Tripoli by storm and to invade the presidential palace of Gaddafi and forcefully remove him from power. He has initiated force against the Libyan people. Indeed, he has been initiating force against them for over 42 years now. So it only stands to reason that the Libyan people have the right to use force in retaliation. And this is their prerogative. If they can remove him with less bloodshed, that would be great. I am not the kind of person who would call for the man to be killed in the course of the uprising. I think it would actually be more edifying for him to be taken captive and then put on trial by the Libyan people for his atrocities. To have these atrocities be exposed to the world and to be systematically documented, as they were with the trial of Saddam Hussein, would be, I think, a great gain for humanity's knowledge of exactly what terrible things this regime has perpetrated. And revolutions don't always end nicely, even if they are for a good cause. And there is a need to be cautious about what will replace Gaddafi. But at the same time, I am very optimistic that this string of protests will not end the way the 1979 revolution in Iran has ended. Because this is a different generation of people with different values who are genuinely, I think, on the cusp of an age of enlightenment in the Middle East. If all of these governments, whether or not they have emerged endogenously through a military coup or some other maneuvering, or have been imposed from without by Western powers such as the United States, if all of these authoritarian shell governments collapse, and these younger generations finally get to have a political say, then great things will happen to the Middle East. And great things will happen in the world. One of the hopes that I have as the outcome of this chain reaction of protests and the toppling of these regimes is the elimination of any feasible threat of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. Because when the Middle East reaches this new age of enlightenment and steps over all of the barriers that have hitherto impeded the coming of this age, the motivation of so many of the residents of that area to commit acts of terrorism, which are typically committed out of desperation, will dwindle and will be reduced to virtually no motivation at all. Wouldn't that be wonderful? It would mean that the entire war on terror waged by the West was completely futile, as I think any sensible, intelligent person will recognize today. And it will also mean that this problem will have been solved by the forces of economic change and technological change and political enlightenment that are so much more in accord with the principles of liberty and reason than the forces of war and the imposition of brute force that have been characterizing the war on terror this past decade. Thank you very much. I hope the Gaddafi regime will fall soon, and when it does, I will certainly celebrate. And I hope that the consequences of that fall will resonate throughout the Middle East and throughout the world.